Oh, hey everybody. This is another test. And hopefully, third time is a charm. I'm trying to stream for like ever. Clearly, I'm a bit rusty on the streaming side of things. I'm pretty good at the recording side of things, but not so much on the streaming side of things. But I really want to show you how to model this specific project in Blender. And I've been struggling to get my audio working. And thank you for any of the guys that are bearing with me with this tedious process. And it seems that I just had some very silly setting wrong that I had to go and check in the stream settings. But finally, it sounds like it's all sorted. Thank you, Joe Lu, for mentioning that. Right, okay, so now we can actually get on with what I want to show you, which is how to model this in Blender. And this is an excellent project to try to model with Blender because it's using subdivision modeling. Beautiful project. It's by Mad Architects. It's a new airport terminal in Changchun, I guess it's pronounced. And I think it's an absolutely excellent project to show you how we can really quickly mock something up with Blender. And so for this specific project, we're going to use a mirror modifier, and I always find it quite useful before we actually start modeling to have a good sketch of what we're trying to do here. So if we look at this cross section, and let's see if this works now. Right, so that's a bit light, probably can't see that. Let's try again. So we're going to model half of it. So we're going to model one half, and then, excuse my chicken scratch, then we're going to model the other half over here, and that's going to be with the mirror modifier. On top of that, what we have here is a lot of strips. So all of these strips here, we're going to model as edge loops inside of them, and then we're going to have a numerous amount of edge loops, and some of those edge loops, they're going to kind of expand, which is what you see over here happening. So in regards to modeling, it's a fairly straightforward stuff. And then we're going to try to put these here to panelize it with the tissue add-on to see the full parametric capabilities of what we're capable of doing fairly quickly and fairly straightforward. Really beautiful shape, by the way. It reminds me of something like a clamshell into it. Cool. So without further ado, now that everybody hears me, let's check out how we can do that in Blender. Now I have Blender open here. So the first thing we want to do is import images as planes. And I already have that image, and we're going to work with the top view model. So I'm going to load this, and we have to enable preview, just so we can see the images as plane. By the way, that's an add-on that you need to enable. So in case you don't have it enabled, you have to go to your add-on properties. And it comes in as quite a strange deformation in regards to the orientation. So I just reset everything so it's clear top view. This is a very good shot to model because it's from a drone. It's very high, so it's definitely quite symmetrical, right? So it seems like it's from a very good point. So when we're modeling from reference photos, when we're trying to do things, we want to try to get pretty good references that we're trying to work with. Hey, Steven. Thanks for joining, buddy. Just downloaded Blender last night, finally. I would have thought you've already played with it by now. All right. Cool. So here we are, and it doesn't matter about the scale because I don't know the precise scale of this because we don't have anything to scale it with. Maybe this bus we can use as a scale factor, but the shape is fairly abstract. So whatever we do, we can go back and adjust the actual shape when we get to it at some point. So let's get started, shall we? So let's add a plane with clicking. Let me enable, by the way, screencast keys, so you can see what I'm doing right over here in the top right hand corner, which is being covered by my image. So let's move my image on the other side. There you go. Shift A, mesh, plane. Scale that up. I have to scale it quite a bit. Go into edit mode. Control R to create a loop cut. Place it exactly in the middle, that's fine. Press 3 to select faces. We want to delete one of the faces. Press X and then faces. So now we have just half. Next, go to add modifier and add a mirror modifier. So now the whole thing is mirrored. And now we can start to modify it. So back in edit mode, we're just working with one part here. And we can start drawing, we can start moving our vertices around. So this is with this vertex mode. So I press 1, 2, and 3. So 1, 2, and 3, in case you guys don't know, are in edit mode: vertex selection, edge selection, and face selection. And what's really good about this project is that it uses pretty much a very default modeling paradigm for these kinds of projects. So let's add a few more loop cuts now. So by the way, if you're new to Blender, you can either use the loop cut tool, which is over here, loop cut, or I'm a little bit old school, so I've been using Blender before they had this really nice and convenient and what you would imagine as a typical toolbar with all the most important icons and tools. So that didn't exist a few years back. So Control R is the hotkey otherwise to do something similar. So now that we have a few extra loop cuts, we can start dragging our shape. And this is our cage mesh. So we don't want to get too detailed with it because sub D is going to help us out with that subdivision modeling. We just want to get in the right ballpark area to get to this shape. So, and subdivision modeling, in case you haven't used it, or you might have used it a little bit, but not too much, is fairly similar to NURBS. It's like a half step between NURBS modeling and subdivision and polygonal modeling, in the sense that now once we add the subdivision surface modifier, and we get something that's fairly simple, fairly smooth, right? So we have our control cage that controls what we're doing here. Okay, so with this object, what I want to do is turn down the alpha a little bit. Now, since it's an image, we have to go in and play a bit more with the settings, or I imported this as an image as a plane, which gets rendered. So this is quite useful if we actually want to edit our image and go inside of it, because it's basically a mesh. But there's also another way to import images. So Shift A, image, reference image. And now if we scale that up, you see we get the same thing, but this is not editable, right? This is basically an empty with an image. But the nice thing about that is a few things. First off, in viewport shading, we still see it, so it's always visible. And second off, it has a a much easier control of opacity, right? So we don't even need to go into the actual shader node in the actual material to change the opacity. We can just do it here. So we can turn down the opacity quite a bit. Hi, nice to see you live. Can I ask you one question? How does the X and Y coordinate show up when you grab a point? Stupid question. So which X and Y coordinates are you talking about? Is it here? So let's go back into editing this, creating a point. So are you talking about this X and Y here? If that's what you're talking about, it might be hidden by default, which is very important sidebar, and you can only tell if you don't know about it with this tiny little arrow here. So if you click on it, you get this sidebar, and that's where you have your XYZ transforms and a lot of other data, including all of your add-ons. You can see here I've been playing with Stable Diffusion in Blender. Different topic for a different stream if you guys are interested into it, by the way. Cool. So back on point here, mirror, subdivision. And now we're starting to see what our shape is looking like. So now we have a very easy cage to play with to start to get this looking more or less the way we want it to look. And the idea with subdivision mesh is to try to keep our poly count to a minimum. So we want to have as little poly as possible. Sometimes we might need to do a bit more, and I'm just going to tap out here, and this image is very big, so we have to go into view and change the end clip to something a little bit larger, just so we see everything that we have. Again, I'm not doing this completely to scale just yet. So I'm going to move my image up high and disable the selection. So we can't click on it. We can only click our mesh. But now if I'm editing my mesh, I should be able to see it on top. But I'm not. Maybe it's because of the transparency. So let's make it then a little bit more opaque. Go to top view. It's still hiding. Okay, it doesn't want to be seen in that view. That's all right. I never really use empties as references. I always use images as references. So I thought I would try in this case. Okay, it has depth side, both front and back. I wonder if it's one of these. Yes, okay, now it seems to work. He means the ones on the vertex tab, right? Sorry. So back to your question. You're saying, how do we see the vertex coordinates? So you can see again, the vertex coordinates are in this position over here, or when you move it around, it's in this area that I can't really click on the top right hand corner. Which shows you where everything is. And then if you click on a element, and if you click on move, you can always see the previous command here. I might need to move myself to this side so you can see it. So over here we also have just the previous command. So that's not only with move, that's with everything else. We can see the vertex coordinates in this case because that's what we're moving. All right, so now we have our image sorted out and a little bit with better visibility. I'm going to start adding a few more loop cuts. So Control R and starting to get this shape to be in the right position. Now people usually have music when they stream, don't they? I didn't think of that when I started. I'm just happy I got my audio working. But maybe for next time, it might be a nice thing. Okay, so you can see what I'm doing here. I see areas that I know, for example, this radius is too much based on what the image that we have underneath is. So how do we fix that? We add an extra loop cut. And the way that subdivision works is that the more edges that we have that are closer to each other, then the easier it gets to being able to actually see what we're doing. So it's sharper basically. Okay, now this is not a very good thing where we have that element overlapping. So let's add more loop cuts. Control R and loop cuts. And if you're really new to Blender, you should know that it's very important that in Blender we work with quad topology. So if you're coming from SketchUp or from nervous-based modelers like Rhino, that might sound a bit foreign to you, but in Blender, because it's a mesh modeling tool, we do need to think about topology on a level that perhaps you might not be used to. So it does take a little bit of getting used to it initially. What does that mean? Basically, every face has to be a quad face. You can model n-gons in their specific cases, but specifically for this kind of workflow that we're doing here, having quads is very important because adding loop cuts, the way we're adding them, only works with having quad faces. It doesn't work with anything else. Okay, so we're getting there slowly. As you can see, getting the shape right. does require a bit of patience and a fair bit of trial and error and adjustments. I think I feel pretty comfortable about that shape, except I notice that here we've got something that looks a little bit different. Okay, so I'm following the white edge, and the white edge more or less seems to be aligned, except in this area it's not quite aligned. So we can grab this vertex and position it somewhere where it aligns a little bit better. Same with this. So now we have a dilemma here. Do we add another vertex to have this slight bulge that occurs in the geometry, or at the cost of having extra elements? Maybe yes. So let's see. That should be able to get it look even better now. And we can probably get this a bit tighter. Now these are all relational, right? So the challenge with working with sub-D is that you just have to play with it to understand how things move and how they relate to each other. Because sometimes when you move one and you think you've got it perfectly aligned in another area, at the end it actually doesn't seem as perfect as perhaps you might have thought initially. So for a sanity check, let's turn off our image reference just to see whether everything looks fairly good and fairly smooth. Now that empty I had moved to a different area, different size, I can move it back down just to see even a little bit in more detail whether everything more or less aligns. And I think for the purposes of what we're doing, we can say that we're in a pretty good shape with our base plane here. So what's always good to do is duplicate this and kind of keep it away for a while. Now I'm looking at this. Yeah, it seems about right, doesn't it? The flare of this bottom edge feels a bit different, but it feels very rudimentary, right? I mean, if we look at the shape, it's that. But this looks so much better because he has depth and detail. All right, so now with this shape, we're ready to start adding some loop cuts. So again, Control R is the shortcut, and then while it's active, you can scroll up with your scroll wheel to add extra loop cuts. And we get them somewhere over here. Now, however, you notice what's happening. Once we add our loop cuts, our geometry is changing. And maybe it's changing a little bit too much. Now we can try and go back and adjust our shape based on this extra geometry, because basically when we have more subdivisions, we can be more refined. But it's also more difficult to follow this curvature as precisely. So instead of doing these loop cuts now, what we can do is use our initial plane. Let's duplicate this as well. Shift D is the hotkey to duplicate. Now I have just the geometry that's here. And with subdivision, we're going to apply it. In fact, we're going to apply all these modifiers here. I'm going to use less levels though. So let's try. We can see exactly the amount of geometry that we have. Turn off the empty and turn off optimal display. So now we see it. Now with the empty. So they're not quite aligned, those loop cuts, but that's okay because we can start to modify them later. But you can see that it's actually starting to match those a little bit, isn't it? But we need more. So if we go to 3, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if we check in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they have one less, and that's okay. We can actually erase one once we're done modifying our shape here. However, our shape, our loop cuts are flowing a bit different than the loop cuts that they have here. So why is that? So they've probably post-processed this a little bit, right? So it's not like as raw as you might think it is from Maya in this case. And that has to do with this edge condition here, right? So in our case, I think this is a good starting point. And then we can go and I'll show you how we can modify that further. All right, so let's apply these. So apply the mirror and apply subdivision. Duplicate this again. So now we have this element and all the vertices and all the edges are baked in, which is, again, a little bit too much information for what we need at the moment. So what we're going to do is actually go back, and we care that this geometry is similar in the boundaries of our original geometry because it comes from it. But we don't want to have any of these loops because they limit the amount of control that we can have, because we still haven't modified this shape in 3 dimensions. Right now we've only modified it in plan, but then we need to go back and modify it in the other dimensions. So if I click this selection, so Alt click to select a loop cut, let's delete these faces, and then press L to delete all of these faces over here. So now we're again only left with 1/2. And now if we click on mirror again, we have the exact same thing. We're getting back to the shape that we had before. Next, let's select edge ring. So Control Alt left mouse. It's a hard one to remember. And we select the whole edge ring. Now we want to reduce the amount of loops that we have in this direction. We want to keep the loops in the other direction. Let's call that the U direction, but in the V direction, there are too many. And an easy way to delete them is by select, checker deselect. So now we've only selected every other one. Let's see how this pans out. This is perfect because we are also now getting rid of the last one. The add-on loop tools could be helpful. Yep, I use it actually a fair bit of times. But for different things, not exactly for this. Curious to see how you might suggest that it's useful in this case. Okay, so with checker deselect, we have the selected one and selected one, and we can change that. So we can deselect 3 and have only every 3rd one available to us, or even more. And actually, it's the other way around. We want to, the ones that are selected are the ones that we're going to get rid of. And we want to make sure that the last, we want to make sure that the first and the last ones are not selected. So this looks pretty good to me. Basically, subdivision works in divisions of 4. So first subdivision is, let's say, each plane, each quad gets divided by 4. Second level subdivision is 4 to the 2nd power, so 16 subdivisions and so on. And we can use that to kind of rebuild something that we had. So let's try, so this is 4, let's try 7. That should work fairly good for us as well. That's good. So now with those selected, we can go to select loops, edge loops. So we have all this extra geometry here. Next, X. So that's the delete menu. And in here we want to select edge loops. So we only want to delete these edge loops. So that deletes it. And it's looking a bit rudimentary now. But if we add subdivision again, so subdivision surface, we should be fairly close to what we had before. Except I see now we have some challenges here in these edges. And let's compare it with the empty, just to see where we are. We might need to, again, tweak it a little bit because maybe we took out too many of those subdivision vertices initially. But what's important, and the reason why we did this, is to make sure that we have loop cuts and they're following the curvature more or less. As you see, it's still not perfect, right? We still need to go back and modify some things. And in fact, I'm going to use loop tools to show you how we can space these out a bit more evenly. And now let's go and adjust this geometry a bit more. So it looks like I got rid of too many loop cuts. That's all right. We can just add a loop cut here. And now it gets a little bit tricky, right? So we don't want to edit vertex by vertex anymore because we have too many loop cuts in this case. So what we can do instead is use soft selection, proportional editing, sorry. It's something I still always call it soft selection. I think that's what it's called in Maya. So now let's press S just to scale, and we have to increase our radius, and all of these are going to scale in that direction. Something like that. Same here. And this one will move. And I'm going to reduce the radius. By the way, when we're active with proportional editing, you can, in a transform command like move or scale, if you scroll up or down, it changes the affecting radius. Okay, that's pretty good. So we have, it looks like even the right number of loop cuts here. So now let's first disable proportional editing, and let's select this loop cut here. So Alt and click to select them all. And I do have loop tools enabled, and what we want to use here is space. And space basically distributes them all evenly. And you can see that, let's see, 1, 2, 3, I think we might have one extra, don't we? Let's delete it then. So I'm going to select this loop cut here. Needed a sip of water, and X, and then loop cut to delete it. We have a funky gap in there, but that's okay. We'll sort it out with the space command. So again, select this stop command here and right click. We want to go now to loop tools. So you have to enable that, by the way. If you go to your add-ons properties, so edit, preferences, add-ons, and look for loop tools and make sure that it's enabled, because it's not enabled by default, but it does come with Blender. So then you should see it here in your menu. So loop tools and space. And then there's also a couple of options here. You can do input selection or input parallel all. And if we do that, sometimes it does all of them. Not always. Not sure why I didn't do it this time. Usually it's pretty good with that. Maybe I have to be in edge selection. Let's try that again now. Loop tools and space. Parallel all. Oh, I have too many things selected. I'm not sure why it's not working. I have had it work, but in this case we can just go and space each area. Or if you guys have any suggestions, let me know. So because of the way that this shape has been modeled, not everything is actually going to align to the natural loop cuts that come in from subdivision modeling. So we do have to modify a couple of things. I thought this shape is going to be a little bit simpler, to be honest, when I started it, but that's all right. So what am I doing now? I'm just manually moving these. So there's a couple of ways to move it. One is just with G, so regular move. Or the other thing is if you press G and then G again, we're sliding the vertices around. So that might be a way to keep them a little bit more aligned. It is water. Too late to drink alcohol here. So I'm just manually moving these a little bit. and they're probably not going to align completely. Everywhere. Right, so let's select this loop cut, alt clicking it, go to loop tools and then space, and that distributes them evenly. Let's repeat that. Space. That's because we lost the loop cut, so we need to take that into account, because otherwise we have this funny gap. Space. And I think this is the last one. Space. Right, so this one is more or less aligned, and that's more or less aligned. Cool. So we have our base shape done. Now we need to move these up and down a little bit. So we have to go back and see a couple of the reference images and see what the shape is doing. So it looks like this area here, specifically for that shape, is more or less flat. Right, we do have a nice perimeter. I'll show you how we can do that as well. And then here we have an area that generally goes up, and then it comes down along the edge. So the three-dimensionality of it is actually not that strong. And then these here, they look like they're actually one-dimensional. So one side comes up and the other comes down, and this probably has to do with some kind of solar analysis that they have done to determine that it might be better to have the sun coming from one side, or it's less indirect, I imagine, based on that angularity that we see here. All right, so let's go back to our shape here then. And let's go into edit mode, select, remember we're only working with one side, so this is a mirrored object. And then we start to move that down. Now I do have, you won't see it, but I do have on my other screen that I'm referencing now the image, just to look at it and make sure that what I'm doing more or less follows what I see with their project in regards to 3 dimensions. And it's not much, again. So it's really this area here coming up. And then this area here coming up. And then we continue with each one until we get something that matches it. Now I also notice that the corners are a little bit lower, and it looks like the middle comes up a little higher. We probably need to see another image of it. This one is not very helpful for that. It's a bit of a detail, so let's go and check out the website. See if they have a few more images that show it just from a different angle. Okay, there's another angle. So the middle one, that goes up significantly higher. Yeah, it's not that three-dimensional. I mean, it is because it's a huge object, right? It's a huge surface. So what seems like a fairly subtle shift in height from here, this is probably, judging by the size of a plane, the z difference between this point and that point there is probably like 20 meters, 15, 20 meters or so. So we can use that as a reference then, can't we? So if I go into here, our origin should be at around 0, but it's a bit tricky because we're not quite aligned to a real world scale just yet. So we can't take that for granted and say that, okay, that's the scale that we need to use. Now, this is snapping to funky things because we're seeing both the cage mesh and the subdivision mesh. So sometimes it gets a little bit difficult to understand which one we need to be looking at. in the subdivision modifier, there is an option to show on cage. So it's this button over here. So if you do that, then the cage and what we're selecting is the same. However, be aware that our gizmo is always at the original point, not at the subdivision point. So if I disable on cage, you see where it is. And if I enable on cage, you see where it stays. Okay, so now we're going to start using a little bit of soft selection again, because clearly that's not exactly what the model looks like. So, proportional editing. So let's start grabbing some of these points here and increasing the radius to start dragging them down. And hopefully by this point you also start to understand why we need to keep everything as low poly as possible, because basically the more poly we have, the worse things start to look in a way. Even this, now I'm realizing that it might have been better to do this with less of these subdivisions initially and then add those in later. In fact, we could probably still do that. So which ones do we want to keep? We want to keep, so we have, let's get rid of this one, and then this one and that one. Okay, so might be every other one then. 1, 2, that one, this one here. We do have an odd number, so it makes it a little bit harder to think of how we do it, because it's not even, so we have like an extra loop cut somewhere at some point. That's right. Okay, so I went and deleted those loop cuts. So now we have a lot less geometry that we can edit with. So now I know that these two vertices need to come down, right? And these need to come down a little bit here as well. These might need to come up. Maybe that comes up slightly. That. And this area still should be a little bit higher, which it is, compared to this area over here. Okay, pretty happy with that. Now we can go back and re-add our loop cuts. So Control R, and Control R to have our shape over here. So let's duplicate this. Basic question: how do you change from vertex select to edge select? So there's object mode, right? So object mode is when we manipulate the objects. It's a little bit different, by the way, if you're coming from SketchUp or Rhino, because they don't have that. But the best way that I can explain it is basically like in design, where you have your container and then you have your content. So the object in this case is the container, and then you have the content inside of it. So if we go into edit mode, then we can modify what's inside of our container, inside of our object. So an object is anything in Blender, right? But there's meshes. It can contain a mesh, or it can contain a camera, or a light, or so on. So now I've gone into edit mode, and in here we have different kinds of selection modes. So vertex, edge, or face selection. And the hotkeys for that is 1, 2, and 3 when you're in edit mode. And edit mode is tab. So that's perhaps the most important hotkey for you to keep in mind. Is there a cage or lattice modifier? Yes, there is. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I use an add-on called Simple Lattice, and check it out. So all I need to do is click on Simple Lattice Create, and it automatically creates a lattice for the right size. And if I move it, it's already applied. And lattice is a modifier, right? So you create a lattice object, but then you need to add it as a modifier on the object onto which we want the lattice to be affected. So if you Google for Simple Lattice add-on on Blender, I think you should get it. I think it was from GitHub that it comes from. It doesn't come bundled with Blender. Alternatively, if you don't have lattice, the simple lattice add-on, you can manually add a lattice modifier, and then Shift A, add a lattice object, and then scale it. Just so our whole element is inside. And now we go back to here and we say lattice, and we should be able to modify it or add more areas that we want to. All right, so let's go back to editing this. All right, so time to do another duplicate. So I usually duplicate backwards. So duplicate to the area outside of the center, because we have our reference image and it's nice to go back to it every once in a while. So now we have our basic loop cuts in place. We have our basic shape in place. What we need to do is add more loop cuts. So if you remember, we have these loop cuts here, but what needs to happen is that we create these kind of seams as openings. So the way we're going to do that is by creating extra loop cuts. Now let's look at the background image just to see where they're happening. And you see we might need to adjust a little bit of, there's always a bit of adjustment, isn't there? All right, maybe just these a little bit better aligned. Okay, pretty happy with that. Okay, so now let's select all these edges. So Alt clicking them and then Shift Alt click to select multiple. And once we have them all clicked, we want to right click and say bevel edges, or Control B. Or in Blender, there's the same commands are in multiple places. There's also the bevel command here in the toolbar. I do, by the way, you can, if you're new to Blender, you can expand the typical toolbar by clicking and holding. If you drag it out a little, it becomes like a 2-column toolbar, and if you drag it a little more, you also get to see the names of the different commands. So that's quite useful if you're not quite used to all the tools. Myself, I'm not as well. Again, I tend to use a lot more of the commands that rely on hotkeys. But if you're a beginner and all the hotkeys might be a bit too daunting, then this is an excellent way to learn the most basic tools. Now, not all tools are in here, by the way, just some of them, but they're the most essential ones. Okay, so right click, bevel edges, and we can drag. It doesn't really matter what the distance is. In fact, sometimes it might be hard to snap to the right distance. And we will now modify this post in this pop-up here. So in bevel, and we have width. We want to keep that to a very small amount. Now, why is that amount so small if our object is so big? Let's undo that. Let's go into object mode. And we see first off we have a negative scale, which is not a good thing. Why is that not a good thing? Because our faces are all facing the wrong way. So if they're red, it means it's not good. So then we have this scale that's actually quite large, and we want to make the scale 1. So we can go to Object and then Apply Scale, and now it becomes 1. So now when we try to bevel, it should work a lot better. So let's turn off face orientation. Go back into edit mode. All of our loop cuts should be selected, and we can go to right click and then bevel edges, And that's a much more appropriate number based on the scale that we're dealing with here, isn't it? And then there are different kinds of offsets. So the one we want to use is absolute offset. And that means that the distance should be the same everywhere. Now it might not appear this way because again we're dealing with a subdiv. So let's get rid of this lattice modifier here. And if we turn off the subdivision, we should see that the width of this loop here is the same as the width that we have in this loop over here. So it appears the same, but it's just because they're spaced out that it looks a little bit different. So let's enable our empty here again, just to see what we need to deal with. So everything is by default very thin. It's not very thick. So I'm going to undo that. Let's try beveling again. And we want to model the most common case scenario. So let's try 0.2. Now again, because we are dealing with subdivision, it does become a little bit harder to create. So what we might want to also do in this case is add edge creases. So let's, on this edges data here, mean crease, if you increase it to 1, you see we get this special color, which means that there's a crease. So what does a crease mean in Blender? It basically means that that corner is going to be pretty sharp in there. And we want to definitely add the crease here as well. So now if we turn off our reference and if we shade it smooth, everything looks smooth. But if we pull one point really high up, you'll notice if we add more levels of subdivision that that's pretty sharp. Now if we change the crease to 0, that's much smoother now. Sharp, smooth, sharp, smooth. So that's essentially what it means. And creases also help us control the bevels. So let's try Control B again. And now because everything is creased, they should be able to stay much closer to their origins. Something like that seems pretty good. Now, because we are using absolute, actually it's not a good thing to use absolute in this case because we might get some overlaps. Because in here, we have a very wide distance in some areas and very narrow distance in other areas. So let's use, what should we use? %. Okay, we can try the regular one, offset, and then just make this something small, like in this case 3. And I'm going to double check the narrowest area and make sure that we're not overlapping. Maybe even 2. There you go. I think that works pretty well. Is there a way to lock view angle like another window with just Z-axis view? You can go to different views, is that what you mean? So if we use this gizmo here, we can go to different views. There's also a way to view quads. So we can go to view, area, and toggle quad view. So now we have, these are locked, right? So these don't move, and we have one perspective area in here. And Control Q is the hotkey for that. Or, because Blender's user face is really flexible, if you drag from one of these corners in between the windows here, we get another option. Can you view model and camera at the same time? Yep. In fact, that's very important, isn't it? So let's say I have a couple of cameras here. I'm going to make my first camera active. And then I'll go to view, align active camera to view. And I know because the object is really big, I need to go into the camera. Need to be in object mode to do that. Go into the camera and end, clip end needs to be much higher. So there it is. So now this window is looking at the camera and here we're modeling. Okay, and if we want to get rid of that window, we can go to join areas and these areas are joined. Right, so back to our modeling. And if we click on this and Math C3Q, no problem, man. Or woman, actually I shouldn't say that because you don't know what people are. Okay, so let's start opening this up a little. And all we're doing now, you see it, it's fairly straightforward, isn't it? We're just dragging vertices to open this up. And I can tell that we might need a few extra support loop cuts in here to get that shape to look like what's been modeled here. So I'm selecting just these vertices and I'm moving them out. And we need to add an extra loop cut here. With the loop cut selected, increase the crease to 1. And let's move these, GG, so they're proportionate, GG, 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 GG. And what's going on the other side? I think everything else is more or less the same, isn't it? It's just here that we have the more interesting geometry. Next, we have a couple of extra, by the way, let's move that up. That out rather. Some over here. Cool. So now let's add more loop cuts. So Control R, put them in the middle. And I'm going to Shift Alt click all of them and make sure the crease is 1, set to 1. So I'm just continuing with that Control R, Shift Alt click, crease to 1. And now let's select all of those. We'll just slightly move them down. Do something like that. Let's turn off our empty just to see what we're getting here. So that's starting to slowly look like what we're after. We might need to increase the level of subdivisions. Yep. Usually 1 or 2, 3 is quite alright. Beyond 3, you have to be careful because then that depends really on your setup, what you've got. All right, so now we have the base shape in there. We have even the base area, so we can assign a couple of different materials. So let's create materials, by the way, are in this area here in case you don't know, and they're always related to the object. So we have to have an object selected, and then we can browse to assign one of the pre-existing materials that we might have in the model, or we can create new materials. So first we create slots, and then in those slots we can create a new material by clicking new. And let's call these, what should we call that? Roof. And then for this one here, let's create new, and let's call that glass. And for glass, we can change the base color or viewport display. So that's only what's being viewed in shaded mode, so not in the preview modes. We're not going to get to that level in this stream. So in viewport display, let's make the glass a blue color, and we want to change the alpha so it appears a little bit transparent and reduce the roughness. So now if you go into edit mode, go into face selection, and we will select, so what might be easier is because we have less loops is to actually select those solid areas. And so Shift Alt click all the face areas. And now we can go to select, invert, or Control I and assign those as glass to get this area. Now let's go now to top view and look at our empty. Sorry, our image. I keep calling it empty. Image backdrop. Since I'm just reading things out, at least I will be reading the correct thing. And where are we? Are we selecting the right thing? Yes, we are. And now let's double check and see if we might need to adjust anything a little bit more. this is a bit wider, but honestly, I think we have the intent correctly. We're not going to model everything exactly as it is. It's more about understanding the workflow and the logic behind it. So now I'm trying to modify things, but some things are not visible. We have to enable X-ray in order to be able to grab everything in some situations. And now I'm continuing to edit these and position them a bit more correctly as per our model here. All right, pretty happy with that. Also, this is looking pretty well. Cool. So let's turn the image backdrop off, turn off X-ray, so we see what we're doing here. And now we can add our edge perimeter. So we can select this whole edge here by alt-clicking. And in fact, we might need to, what do we need to do here? Alt-click just selects this edge, then Shift-Alt-click to select this edge here, and then Shift-Alt-click to select this edge over here. And let's now duplicate it. Shift-D, Z, and I'm just going to move it. What are we going to move it? Wow, we're making this very big, that's a kilometer high up. So units, not quite right, as I mentioned before. Okay, so we have the shape over here. Is there any easy way to grab an entire loop cut, or do you need to select edge, vertex along the loop cut you made? So alt-clicking is the way to select loop cuts. That's the easiest way to do it. You can also, because all this geometry is linked, like these are connected and this is connected. So if I press L here, and I need to only hover over it and then press L, it selects everything that's linked. A and Alt-A toggle selection or deselection, which is also all here in the select menu. And if I hover over this object and press L, it selects everything there. Hi, Andrew Joko. All right, so now let's go back in here and we're going to make this edge, but we need to simplify this. So we want to get rid of these extra vertices that we put in specifically. So I have all these vertices selected, so we can go to X and then dissolve vertices. So it makes it a little bit flatter. And we need to do the same on the other side. It's actually fairly flat on this side, isn't it? Well, in any case, since we're doing it, we might as well do it everywhere. X, dissolve vertices. All right, so now that we have this, we can go and E to extrude, E, and then press Z to keep it up along the Z axis here. Okay, and now let's select everything, L, and I'm going to move it back down 500 units. So minus 500 to get it in the correct place. And now we need to add a bit of thickness to it. And that height that I gave it is too much. So let's select the top edge by alt-clicking on it. Move that down. Select everything, L, and we want it to go slightly lower. Right, so now that we have it all selected, this command actually does exist, and I'll show it to you in here. So we want to go now to extrude region, but not quite extrude region. So if you click and hold, we want to extrude along the normals. So enable that command, and we have this kind of window here, or what should we call it? Gizmo. And we drag that out. We can be precise, I think. Let's try 5. That first off, did that do it in the right direction? Looks like it did. And we can change that if we don't think it's thick enough. But it's because this is part of our subdivision model, you can see that it's too smooth. We want those edges to be sharp. So we can select them, alt-click, then Shift-Alt-click. One thing that's really nice in Blender that once you get used to it, you think, why isn't anybody else doing it, is that selections are also part of the undos. So if you accidentally select the wrong thing or deselect the wrong thing, you can press Ctrl Z and go back. So let's add a crease to these to make that edge sharp. And now let's give it a different material. So L to select the whole thing, create a new slot, create a new material, and let's call it edge. And viewport display will make it some kind of dark color over here. So now we've got this thing set up. Now I don't think we extruded in the right direction. That's okay. We can move these. There's another quite nice command here. So it's shrink and flatten. So if we click on that, it should allow us to move this. Oh, okay. So we have to be careful because now it's shrinking, flattening the whole thing because our loop cut runs all the way around, doesn't it? So let's undo that. Because this is a mirrored object, we have some situations where I know there's been some extra faces that have been created that we need to clean up manually. So let's make sure that we're into X-ray mode here. And it's this face here. So X face, that should be good. And now on the other side as well. X face. Sometimes it might be a little bit hard to zoom into an area, just like all the other programs. If that happens, you can select something. And if you use the tilde button, which is the button on top of your tab button and below your escape. If you're using an American keyboard, I don't know what it is on different keyboards. I use American style one. I think whatever that button is, that's not a 1, it might work on your keyboard as well. So, and then you get this nice pie menu here and you can go to view selected, or if you do have a number pad, so view, let's see, frame selected, number pad, dot. So it would be the dot, the period or dot in your number pad, and that resets your view. All right. So now if we try to alt click that face loop, and if we shrink and flatten it, it should only be that bit. I'm getting some artifacts here that has to do with the very, very wide range of clip start and end. If we make our clip start like 2 meters, they should go away. And the whole display should be a bit smoother. This is too much now, isn't it? Right, I think that's pretty nice. Now, some of these, they go up, and by the looks of it, let's pull this image again. It looks like it's only the right sides that are pulled up higher. So sunk should come in from the left side. I imagine that must be the north side. So we can grab some of these vertices in here. That's going to be a bit tricky. So to do that accurately, we need to apply our mirror modifier, which has done pretty good for us so far, but maybe there is no more need for it. So once again, let's duplicate our object, Shift D. And with this object here, let's apply the mirror modifier. So now we don't have it. Nothing changes, but now we have this kind of independent capability to move just on one side. And that's what we want, isn't it? So we can select these edges here. I'm shift clicking them. And moving them up a little. Like that. Did I forget one? I think I forgot one. And it looked also like the middle. Let's go back to the reference image. I had another one somewhere. Oops. So the middle comes up a bit more, doesn't it? So let's select this whole loop cut then. Can you save selection sets? Yes, you can. They're called vertex groups. And there's a newer feature which I haven't had a need to use it yet. So if you go into this green icon over here, you have object data properties. So you've got vertex groups, which are exactly that. So I can grab a couple of vertices and add a group and assign them. Now if I deselect everything, select and assign it. We can also go to weight paint, and you see that vertex group being represented as a weight map. There's a newer feature called face maps. I believe that's the same, but it's specifically for faces, which, yeah, I don't know why you would use that. I wish they had edge groups, because sometimes you might want to select this edge and this edge, but not that edge or that edge. There's no way to do that, because if we select all of these vertices, they're all bounding the same face. And if we assign them, it's basically the whole face. So in short, yes, there is an opportunity to save edges, save selection sets. Okay, so let's see again the reference image for this. And that's also extending a little bit wider, isn't it? So it's going all the way back to almost to the rear, but it's actually, from this view, it's not popping up any higher. I thought it is, but maybe it's not. So let's undo what I did over here, including moving that edge. I'm undoing a lot. Just a tip, if you have to undo a lot of steps, make sure you press save a few times before that. If you press save, you can still undo, but sometimes it can crash if you're undoing something quite heavy. And another thing to be aware of is in preferences, in system, the default undo steps are 32, which is not enough. I usually make that 132. That seems to be enough for most cases. All right, let's keep on doing that. Okay. What do we say? That we need to basically move a vertex, and I'll just move that one there because I think that would look quite nice to have that middle bit go a little bit more. So that's the basic shape that we've got here, and we have an edge. Now, how do we add those panelings? Because there's a really nice level of panelization in there. Now, I can tell you exactly how they've done it. It's a process that involves taking this geometry and having these edges, these loops, exported, and then bringing them into Grasshopper and just having those curves, subdividing those curves by the same numbers, making sure that the distances are the same, and then connecting them, and those are your subdivisions. That's the long way, but we have a shortcut way here in Blender, don't we? So we're going to create a panel, which appears tiny with whatever horrendous scale I chose, but let's say that this is our panel here. And with our panel, what do we want to do? What's the point of having a panel? It's really, it's first off, that's how it's built, right? Because it has to be separated in one way or another. But there's also nice edge quality that they did in there. So first off, let's apply the scale here. Now let's go into edit mode, select the face, and we're going to inset the face. So you can click on inset here, click and hold, and we'll just inset something like this here. Let's separate the geometry now. So right click and not separate, split. So what does that do? Now that should be its independent element here. So select the edge and we'll extrude just the edge. Extrude along normals. Doesn't matter because the normals are the same, really. And that edge might be a little bit too thick compared to what they were showing, but that's okay. Let's say that this is our panel now, and let's let's create a couple of materials. So we'll call first one frame, second one panel. Going to give a dark color, and the panel, let's assign it a second material slot. That's our panel here. Very straightforward things here. Let's rename it panel, and we'll rename this here as roof base. Okay, so now we're going to tessellate this with the help of the tissue add-on. Tissue add-on comes bundled with Blender, and it's really one of the hidden superpowers of Blender, because it allows us to do things that typically we would have to bring this into Grasshopper or in some other way in order to get this to make it right. So now, if in case you don't have it enabled, you have to go to Edit Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Tissue. You see I have two tissues. One is the bundled version, and the other one is whatever the latest thing is that Alessandro is working on, the creator of Tissue. By the way, I'm having a podcast with him. You may know we try to do a live question and answers session with him. I wanted to stream that to a few more places, which didn't work out right. Clearly, I have to stream more, it seems, to get the technology working on the right side. So this is the one that comes from his GitHub, so it's the latest. This is Blender 3.5, which came out yesterday, and I see that I need to install Number here, which makes things a little bit faster. So let's give it a minute. Or a few. I might have to look into that later, see why it's not installing. Anyways, so with Tissue enabled, we'll select this and then shift select our panel. Now, very, very important. We have to make sure we don't have too many levels of subdivision. And even better is to understand exactly what's happening with the subdivision by going to wireframe mode and disabling optimal display. Okay, so right away, what's happening here is that we have too many subdivisions in one direction and not that many in the other. So our panel has to be a little bit different, because basically this panel is going to get mapped onto each face, but we don't quite want it that way. So what I'm going to do a different panel. Shift A, mesh plane. Let's scale it up a little bit. The actual scale doesn't matter because the bounding box of our panel gets mapped to the bounding box of each face. So we have something like this. So I'm going to do two loop cuts here, and let's scale them up. We're going to make it directional. So we're going to have a cut or a seam only in one direction. The other direction is going to be continuous. So let's get rid of, or let's split this and select these two faces here, move them slightly down, and then E is the hotkey to extrude. And I want to get rid of these two faces here. So selecting these two. And then again, I want to, we already have created them, so I'm just going to look for the frame material. And then second one, select this face, assign it, and that should be panel. Okay, so that's our element. So yeah, it's important to pay attention and understand what's happening with the topology. So now we want to tessellate only on a specific layer or a specific, so we don't want panels everywhere. Although there are panels, there are glass panels that are happening in this area here. and we definitely don't want anything with the edge. So this edge here, L, we can separate it into its own object so it doesn't get in the way. So we can go to right click, separate selection. So now that's a separate object. So this object only has glass and those panel areas. So for the purposes of what we're doing here, we will only cover the solid panels. So let's go to tissue. And here we have a couple of options to tessellate. There's also one that's called by material. And that's what we're going to use here. So we want our panel's name to match the name of the material. So in this case, it should be called roof. So let's rename this F2 and call it roof. So now if we click on the material, can't find, okay, so I need to have this selected. And now let's try it again. So this comes up and let's turn on merge. Everything else we can keep the same. And we should see our panelization. Now by default, it might not all be oriented in the same direction. So we need to change that. So how do we change that? So the easiest way to do it is to click on our roof base, which is, that's the edge, and this is the roof base. Go into top view, select everything, and well, first we'll try it the very basic way, which is just a simple unwrap. So next, let's click on the tessellation, and the tessellation settings, they live in the object data properties. If we scroll the way down, expand the rotation subtab. In the rotation, change from default to active UV. Let's see if that fixes them. Doesn't quite fix them. So then there's a smarter way, let's say, of doing it, which is if we first off make sure we understand what's happening, is maybe turn that off. Let's enable optimal display so we don't see everything. Let's find a nice face. Let's say this face here. Or let's say that face there. So if you press U, it's the same as this UV menu here. U, and unwrap, then select everything else. Make sure this one stays active, and then press U and follow active quads. Now that should work a little better. So if we click on our tessellation now and refresh, and we do get everything in the correct orientation. Great. So that's kind of it. So if we want to have more subdivisions, there are a couple of ways to do it. We can actually have our component be smart as well. So in this case, all we need to do is add an array in the other direction. So instead of in this direction here. And now we should have twice as many. So let's refresh. And you see that we have twice as many. Now they're overlapping because we have those faces are in the exact same place. So maybe for the purposes of what we're doing here, we don't actually need this face. We only need these, don't we? We only need the mullions. So let's refresh. And we should get them all in there. And that's still completely linked to our model, right? So if we go to this model here and we decide that we want to do something quite crazy, like that. And now if we select on our tessellation and we refresh, and you see it all updates itself. And so let's undo these couple of steps. and the level of precision is actually good. I mean, you can see it. It's pretty much exactly what they had there. What we do need to be wary of is that based on the scale size, some of these are thinner and some of them are thicker. So that's problematic when we're thinking about actual construction. But for the most part, and you can see that some of them are also not quite rotated the right way. To fix that, we would need to go into the UV editor and make sure that we look at the faces and they're following the right direction. But I think for, how long has it been now? An hour and 20 minutes. So for an hour and 20 minutes, you know, we got probably fairly far, and we have something that's completely parametric in a way. Why is the stream thumbnail different from the actual stream? I don't know. It's been a while since I have streamed, and I think it's just the default image that it uses because I didn't schedule this stream. Maybe I should have scheduled it and then we'll get a different stream. So, do you guys have any more questions from anybody? Now let's compare this. With what we've got here. It looks like maybe it's just the image. These are also going in a different way, or I'm not sure. I'm sure they're going in that same way. And you know, we only model the top right because that's the most complicated part. But you can imagine that we model the rest. So these are the walkways to the gates, and they're fairly similar. So we'll do the edge. It has a little bit of interesting geometry happening here with some glass, and it's also completely mirrored. And then we have the facade panel, which is fairly straightforward as well. I will actually end it at this point. And if you guys are interested into it, I can maybe do another stream where I finish it completely, or I'll have this model up on my Patreon, by the way, in case anybody's interested to check it out and the process. But yeah, if there's interest, I can continue with this model and kind of maybe finish the modeling, and then we can also look at more of representation techniques as well. Up to you guys. But for now, I think this will be it, and we can continue another time. So yeah, let me know in the comments if you would like me to continue with this, or if you have other suggestions, if there's something interesting that you guys would like to see how it's modeled. I'll be very happy to look into that. So please give me your suggestions. Cool. And see you guys next time.